They opened a door they didn't understand, and something on the other side looked back. That is how Dr. Marin Solis described it afterward. In the deposition she gave to the Joint Interplanetary Defense Tribunal, voice flat and clinical in the way that voices get when a person has burned through all their available terror and come out the other side into something quieter and more permanent. She did not use the word I. She used the phrase transdimensional sensory organ because she was a scientist and precision mattered to her even when nothing else did anymore. The tribunal's recorder got it all down. The tribunal members sat behind their glass partition and said very little. There was not much to say. The sensor footage from Lab 9 spoke for itself. But this story does not begin in the tribunal chamber. It begins 6 weeks earlier. In a converted industrial building on the outskirts of Callaway Station. On a night when the wind came off the highlands smelling of copper and rain, and Dr. Jonah Marsh was peering into something he absolutely should not have been peering into. Jonah was not a bad man. That is important to establish. He was a brilliant man, and brilliant men sometimes convince themselves that brilliance is a kind of permission. He had spent 11 years constructing a theoretical framework for what he called dimensional refraction. The idea that with the right frequency of directed electromagnetic pulse, a human observer could perceive beyond the standard 4 dimensions of observable space into regions of existence that physics had long theorized but never touched. He had published. He had been laughed at. He had published again. He had been laughed at again. More quietly this time, because some of the mathematics were uncomfortably sound. He had applied for grant funding 7 times. He had received it once, contingent on results, and he had come to Callaway Station with his equipment and his assistant and his desperate, lurching hunger to be right about something. His assistant was Marin Solis, 28 years old, 2 weeks from finishing her doctoral thesis on non-Euclidean wave propagation. She had taken the posting because the pay was real, and because Jonah's math was, as she'd told her roommate over the phone, completely insane or the most important thing anyone has ever put on paper. And I want to be there when we find out which. They found out which on a Tuesday. The device was not dramatic to look at. It was a ring of copper-wound electromagnetic coils, 2 meters in diameter, mounted on a frame of welded steel, and connected by approximately 4 kilometers of fiber optic cabling to a signal processing unit the size of a wardrobe. At its center, where the focal point of the refracted field would be, Jonah had suspended a specially prepared optical sensor, a camera essentially, though one modified to detect frequencies far outside normal human perception. The theory was that the pulsed field would create a momentary aperture, a thinning of the dimensional membrane, and whatever existed beyond it would be briefly, partially visible. What no one had considered, because it had never occurred to anyone to consider it, was that visibility is a two-way phenomenon. Marin was at the signal board when Jonah ran the first successful calibration sequence. The copper coils hummed. The air inside the ring went strange and pressurized, the way air feels before lightning, and the optical sensor recorded 22 seconds of footage that looked like nothing in any catalog of known physical phenomena. Jonah watched it on the monitor, with his hands pressed flat on the desk and his breathing gone shallow, and then he watched it again. And then he said very quietly, "Marin, come here." She came. She watched. On the monitor, in the thin space at the center of the ring, something enormous was visible. It was not visible in the way that objects are visible in ordinary space. It was visible the way a thought is sometimes visible in a person's eyes. Suggested rather than stated, present in absence rather than in substance. It was there, and it was looking at them. "That's a..." Marin started. "I know what it looks like," Jonah said. "It's looking at the sensor." "I know, Jonah. It knows the sensor is there." He was quiet for a moment. The recording ran its 22 seconds and looped back to the beginning. The shape in the thin space watched them watch it, patient and vast and utterly without expression. "Run the sequence again," Jonah said. She should have said no. She understood that later, in the way that you understand things you can't undo. She ran the sequence again. What emerged from the aperture, when Jonah pushed the field to its second stage intensity, was not something that English had good words for, and Marin would spend the rest of that year trying to find them. The entity was predominantly sensory. It experienced the world through observation, in a way that was not analogous to human sight but was close enough to be readable. It was approximately 3 meters in its largest dimension. It was self-contained, which meant it had a boundary that could be perceived, unlike most things in that frequency range. It was intelligent. That last fact became apparent within the first 40 seconds of its emergence, when it oriented itself not toward the equipment or the walls or the door, but toward Jonah Marsh's face, with a precision and deliberateness that was completely unlike the behavior of an animal encountering a new environment. It was studying him. Jonah made a sound that Marin had never heard from him before, a low, involuntary note, something between wonder and the first syllable of fear. And then he said, "Remarkable," which was the most Jonah Marsh thing to say, and he reached toward it. She grabbed his arm. He pulled against her grip she held. "Don't," she said. "It's not threatening anything. It doesn't need to threaten anything. It's from the 8th spatial dimension. We don't know what it eats, what it wants, perceives us as. It's just looking. So was every predator in evolutionary history," Marin said, before it decided it was hungry. Jonah looked at her. His eyes were bright with the particular brightness that had been burning in them for 11 years. She recognized it. She had seen it in the mirror sometimes, in her own work, and she had learned to be afraid of it in herself. 48 hours, she said. We observe, we record, we do not interact, we do not introduce any new stimuli. At the end of 48 hours, we run a full analysis and we decide together. Jonah looked at the entity. The entity looked at Jonah. "All right," he said. He lied. She knew he would. She knew it the way you know a storm is coming when the barometric pressure drops, not because you can see storm yet, but because you can feel what the world is becoming. She set up a continuous recording array and went to sleep at 0200 and was back in the lab by 0600, and in those 4 hours, Jonah had run 3 additional field sequences, each one longer and higher intensity than the last, and the entity had grown. Not in the way that living things grow. It did not expand outward from a center. It deepened. It became more present. The air around it had changed quality, not temperature exactly, not pressure exactly, but something adjacent to both, a sense of being observed that was physical rather than psychological, that pressed against exposed skin and made the eyes water. And in the corner of the lab, on the floor beneath the coil frame, Jonah's original optical sensor, the modified camera, had been removed from its mount. The lens was shattered. The casing was intact, but something had passed through it, through the glass and the sensor array and the circuit board behind it. Something that moved through solid matter the way water moves through a screen. Marin stood in the doorway of the lab for a long time. Then she walked to the signal board and pulled the primary power coupling. The coils went dark. The hum died. The entity remained. Of course it did. Of course it remained. It was not a projection. It was not a transmission. It had come through. Jonah was asleep in his chair with his head on his folded arms, and Marin stood between him and the entity and looked at it directly for the first time. It looked back. The sensation of its attention was like having a light shone into the back of your skull. Not painful, not warm, just present, undeniable, the way gravity is present and undeniable. She picked up her tablet and began to document. She documented for 6 hours. The entity did not move in those 6 hours, though it continued to observe. And by the 2nd hour, she had stopped flinching at its attention and started taking careful note of its behavioral patterns. It tracked movement. It responded to light, not visual light but electromagnetic output generally, and it oriented itself toward the signal processors and the active monitoring equipment with a kind of low-level interest that she cataloged as environmental assessment. It did not approach her. It did not approach Jonah. It was as far as she could determine waiting. "What for?" she asked at once, out loud, because the silence was getting large, and she was a scientist, and scientists talk to their subjects. The entity oriented toward her voice. The pressure of its attention sharpened momentarily, and then settled back to its ambient level. Did not answer. She had not expected it to. She had not expected it to answer yet. Jonah woke up at noon and looked at the entity for a long time without speaking, and then he said, "Has it done anything?" "It's been studying the equipment, particularly the signal processors." "It can perceive the equipment?" It can perceive everything. It's an observational organism, Jonah. It experiences reality through a sensory apparatus that operates at dimensional frequencies we've barely started to map. Our entire lab is an open book to it. Our equipment, our data, probably our biology. She paused. Possibly our thoughts. He was quiet. On the far side of the lab, the entity hung in the air between the coil frame and the wall, watching them have this conversation. We need to call the Institute, Marin said. We need more time. We have had time. We have made first contact with an extra-dimensional intelligence, Jonah. This is no longer a private experiment. He turned to look at her, and his face had something in it she had not seen before. Not the bright hunger of discovery, but something closer to grief, the look of a man who has found the thing he spent his whole life looking for, and is realizing, too late, that he did not think carefully enough about what finding it would cost. Give me one more day, he said. No. Marin, I'm calling the Institute. She walked to the communications terminal, in the anteroom, and began composing the contact request. And that was when the lights went out. Not a gradual failure, not a flicker. The power simply stopped, all of it simultaneously. Should not have been possible, because the lab ran on a triple redundant supply grid with independent breaker systems for each circuit. The darkness was total. Marin stood with her hands on the communications terminal and waited for the backup generator to kick in. The generator did not kick in. In the darkness, she could see the entity. Not in any visual sense. There was no light in the room. But the entity was perceptible in the dark the way a heat source is perceptible. Not through any specific sense, but through some aggregate signal that the nervous system processed below the level of conscious thought. She knew where it was. She knew it was moving. Jonah, she said. No answer. Jonah. She moved toward where she thought the door was. Carefully, one hand extended. Her fingers found the wall. She moved along it. The sense of the entity's presence intensified, and then held steady. And in that steadiness, she understood something that she had not fully processed. In the 6 hours of daylight observation, the entity was not waiting anymore. She found the door. She opened it. Corridor outside had emergency strip lighting, amber, inadequate, deeply comforting. She went through and pulled the door shut behind her and stood in the corridor and breathed. The generator's startup panel was at the end of the corridor, a red metal box bolted to the concrete wall. She walked to it and opened it, and the interior was intact, circuits untripped, and she activated the manual bypass and the backup grid came on. And the corridor lights went full and she heard Jonah say, from behind the lab door, Marin, what happened? She went back. The lab looked the same as she had left it. The entity was in the same position. Jonah was standing at his desk, blinking in the returned light, looking disoriented in the way people look when they've woken up twice in the same day. But the signal processors were different, not visually. Visually, they were unchanged. Marin had been staring at those processors for 4 months and she knew their output signatures. The way a pianist knows the sound of a specific key and the numbers running across the secondary monitor were wrong. Not wrong in the way of a malfunction. Wrong in the way of something that had been subtly, precisely, deliberately altered. She sat down and looked at the numbers for a long time. Jonah, she said. Come look at this. He came and looked. What is that? He said. That, she said, is the access log for the dimensional frequency calibration system. It's been rewritten. She scrolled. Not corrupted, rewritten. Specific parameters have been changed. Increased. The field output ceiling has been raised by a factor of approximately 40. Jonah stared at the screen. Behind them both, the entity observed. It accessed the system, Jonah said, through the processors, while the lights were out. While I was in the corridor and you were apparently asleep. She turned and looked at the entity directly. It rewrote our equipment to produce a stronger field. A field strong enough to. She stopped. To what? To maintain a stable, long-term aperture. She turned back to the screen. Her voice was very controlled. It wasn't waiting to see what we'd do. It was waiting for an opportunity to do what it needed to do. It came through our aperture. It studied our technology, and it modified our equipment to keep the door open. Permanently, Jonah sat down heavily. It's not here to be studied, Marin said. It's here to stay. What happened in the next 6 hours tested the limits of what Marin Solis could do while afraid. Fear was familiar to her in the abstract. She had been afraid of failing, afraid of wasting her ability, afraid of becoming ordinary. This was different. This was the cellular variety, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind, that makes the hands shake, and the vision narrow, and the decision-making process both faster and more brutal. She worked. She could not shut the aperture from the control side, because the entity had changed the calibration parameters, and she did not have the access codes for the new configuration. She could find them. It would take time. She could destroy the processors. But without knowing whether the aperture was, now, self-sustaining, destruction might accomplish nothing. She could attempt to force the entity back through, but she had no mechanism for that. She worked. Jonah was in the lab with the entity. She had told him to leave and he had not left, and she had decided to accept that because she could not physically remove him. And she did not have time to argue. She could hear him through the open door talking to it. She had stopped listening to what he said. She was focused on the calibration logs. The entity, she had noted in her documentation, responded differently to Jonah than to her. With her it was observational, the distant, assessing attention of a researcher examining a specimen. With Jonah it was something she could only describe as interest. Not warmth, not hostility. Something closer to the way a very sophisticated piece of machinery might orient toward the person who had built it. Recognition, maybe, or the dimensional equivalent of it. She did not know if that was better or worse. She worked. By hour 3, she had reconstructed approximately 70% of the new calibration code from the access logs. It was enough to tell her that the aperture was not yet self-sustaining. It still required active power input from the station grid, which meant that cutting power to the building would close it. The entity had modified the ceiling but had not yet had time to decouple from the power dependency. It needed electricity. The aperture needed electricity. She sat very still with that information for approximately 4 seconds. Then she went to the door. Jonah. He was standing close to the entity, closer than she would have stood. Close enough that she could see the air around it was distorted. The faint shimmer that she'd attributed to heat but now understood was something else. Dimensional pressure, place where the fabric of their space was still thin, still recently wounded. Jonah, I need you to step away from it and come here. He turned. His face was extraordinary. She had known him for 4 months, and she had never seen it look like that. Not triumphant, not frightened, not even excited. Peaceful. The way a person looks when they have been arguing with themselves for a very long time and have finally stopped. It's communicating, he said. Come here. Not with language, but it's communicating. Marin, the things I'm perceiving right now. Jonah, if you walk toward me right now, I can close the aperture. If you don't, I'm doing it anyway. He looked at her. If you close the aperture, it severs the connection. Yes. We may never reestablish it. I know. 11 years, he said. 11 years of this. I know. Walk toward me. The entity moved. Not quickly. It did not lunge or strike or rush. It simply repositioned. The way a chess piece repositions. Deliberate, efficient, from here to there in a motion that involved no visible intermediate steps. One moment it was where it had been, between Jonah and the coil frame. The next moment it was between Jonah and Marin in the doorway. Marin took a step back. The entity's attention focused on her, with the concentrate of force something that had been partly distracted and was now present. The pressure against her skin sharpened. Her vision did something strange. Not blackness, not loss of focus, a kind of additional clarity, as if she were suddenly perceiving frequencies beyond her normal range. Brief hallucinatory overlay of something that might have been the 8th dimension pressing through her standard 4. She saw for a moment the entity fully, all of it. Not just the boundary she could perceive in ordinary space, but the totality of what it was, the dimensionality of it, the vast unrolled extent of an intelligence that existed in spatial axes she had no names for. It was not looking at her, it was reading her. She turned and ran for the power junction. The junction was in the basement, 2 floors down, accessible by a stairwell at the end of the building. She took the stairs 3 at a time. She could feel the entity behind her. Not hear it, not see it. Feel it in the specific oppressive way she now associated with its presence. The pressure sense that had become as readable to her as footsteps. It was following, not fast. It did not need to be fast. It was mapping the building with its senses in real time, cataloging exits and access points, and the locations of all the electromagnetic systems it might need. And it was doing all of this while moving after her at a pace that was perfectly measured. That said, "I am not afraid of you. I have time." She hit the basement level at a dead sprint, found the main junction panel by memory in the half-dark, got it open, and looked at the breaker array. In all the years of panic planning, she had never planned for this specific situation. She had planned for fire. She had planned for equipment failure. She had planned for a hostile colleague, or a funding collapse, or a result so unexpected that she'd have to scrap 3 years of work and start again. She had never planned for what to do when an extra-dimensional intelligence was 4 feet behind her and she needed to cut power to a building without triggering the backup grid that was, thanks to her, now fully operational. The backup grid, which she had turned on herself an hour ago in the corridor. The backup grid had its own breaker panel, a separate physical system, isolated from the main grid by design, which meant cutting the main grid would immediately trigger the backup, which would maintain power to the lab, which would keep the aperture open. She needed to cut both simultaneously. She had one pair of hands. She stood at the main junction panel and did the math, and the math was simple, and the answer was no. One person, 2 separate physical systems, no remote control, no automation, no tools beyond what was in this room. The math said no. She looked at the main junction panel. She looked at her hands. She looked at the darkness of La Garwelwer and felt the pressure of the approaching entity, and she thought, "All right. Think like a scientist. What do you have?" What she had was a junction panel, a breaker array, a metal building, 2 kilometers of copper cabling in the walls and floors and ceilings of this structure, and an entity that experienced the world primarily through electromagnetic perception. She pulled out her tablet. The building's internal systems were on the station intranet. She still had network access. She pulled up the HVAC control panel, environmental systems, thermostat, air handling, circulation fans. All of it controlled electronically. All of it drawing current through the same copper cabling that carried the main power grid throughout the building. She opened the HVAC override. She maxed every circulation fan in the building simultaneously. She maxed the thermostat to 40 Celsius. She activated every electrical system she could reach from the control panel. The sterilization lamps in the storage rooms, the ultrasonic cleaners in the equipment bay, the dehumidifiers, the water heater, the charging stations. She pulled every breaker she could reach in the main junction panel, and then she walked to the wall and pulled the single manual cutoff for the emergency backup system. A lever, orange-handled, rated for exactly the scenario she was describing to herself as she pulled it, which was, "Pull this if everything else has failed and you need the lights out right now." The building went dark, all of it. Every circuit simultaneously overwhelmed and cut. No backup, no partial power, total blackout. She stood in the basement in absolute dark and counted to 60. On the upper floors in Lab 9 without power, the electromagnetic coils of Jonah Marsh's dimensional refraction device wound slowly down. The field they had been generating dissipated. The aperture, which was not yet self-sustaining, which still required active power, the entity had not yet had time to decouple from the grid, folded, not explosively, not dramatically, the way a wave folds back into the ocean when there is nothing left to drive it forward. In the basement, Marin felt the pressure change, the oppressive weight of observation that had been pressing against her skin since she'd descended the stairs. The presence she could feel more clearly than she'd ever been able to articulate was gone. She did not move for a long time. She stood in the dark and breathed and waited for her hands to stop shaking. And when they did not stop shaking, she decided she did not need them to stop and turned her phone's flashlight on and went back up the stairs. Lab 9 was empty, not abandoned, empty. Nothing had been disturbed. The equipment was in its places. Jonah's notes were on his desk. The coffee mug she'd been drinking from at 0200 was where she'd left it, cold and half full. Coil frames stood in the center of the room, and the air inside it was ordinary air, ordinary pressure, ordinary 4-dimensional space, with nothing looking at her from the other side. Jonah was sitting on the floor in the corner of the room. His back was against the wall, His knees were drawn up. He was looking at the place where the entity had been. Marin sat down beside him. Not close. Close enough. Did it go back, he asked. I think so. You think? The aperture is closed, the power is cut. Theoretically, without the field, there's nothing for it to maintain a foothold in this dimensional space. She paused. But I don't know. It had modified the calibration. I don't know how far along that modification was. I don't know if it was able to decouple from the power dependency before I cut the grid. How do we find out? We wait, she said, and we watch. And if the temperature in this room changes, if the electromagnetic baseline starts to drift, or if any of the signal processors come back online without power, we'll know, he said. We'll know. They sat in the dark lab with their phone lights and they waited. After a while, Jonas said, I'm sorry. Marin did not say anything. The things it was showing me, he said. I understood it, Marin. Whatever it was doing, communicating, projecting, whatever the mechanism was, I could follow it. I could follow the shape of what it was trying to convey. He stopped. It was extraordinary. What was it conveying? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Hunger, he said finally. Not malice, not cruelty. It wasn't cruel. It was just very, very hungry, and we had opened a door to a place full of food, and it had come through and it needed the door to stay open. He looked at his hands. It modified the equipment not to trap us. It didn't care about us, particularly. It modified the equipment because it was hungry, and the door needed to stay open for more of them to come, through more of them. Marin looked at the coil frame and thought about that. You said things, she said, about what it was perceiving, about the eighth dimension. Yes. What's in it? He was quiet again. The phone lights made pale circles on the floor between them. More of them. He said, a great many more. In the morning, she filed the contact report to the Institute. She filed it in its entirety, including the footage, including the calibration logs, including the modified parameters the entity had introduced. She filed it with a cover note that said, "This is the most important document I will ever write, and I am asking that it be treated accordingly." The Institute's response took 72 hours. In those 72 hours, Marin and Jonah stayed in the lab. They slept in shifts. They monitored every available metric. Electromagnetic baseline, barometric pressure, temperature, the output of the signal processors, the status of every circuit in the building. They kept the power cut. They ate protein bars from the emergency supplies in the storage closet, and they did not speak very much. On the second night, Jonah said, if they come back through, if the modification held somewhere, if there's a residual aperture we can't detect, we deal with it, Marin said. How? She thought about the basement. She thought about the circuit panel and the HVAC override and the orange-handled lever and 60 seconds in the dark. We use what we have, she said. That's all we ever do. We use what we have. The response from the Institute was not what she had expected. She had expected disbelief, had written the report assuming disbelief, and had structured her evidence to counter it. She received instead was a response that suggested. The Institute had already been monitoring anomalous dimensional activity in the Callaway station area for several months and had been waiting, with increasing unease, for someone to explain it. The explanation, it turned out, was them. Or rather, it was the device, which had been leaking low-level dimensional refraction for months during calibration testing, and the leak had been perceived on the other side as an invitation. And what had come through the full power aperture had not been a random entity, drawn by curiosity but a scout. A scout sent to assess the location and report back. Whether the report had been made before the power cut was, as the Institute's senior analyst in his follow-up communication, an important unanswered question in the current situation. Marin read that and sat with it for a while. Then she called the Institute's senior analyst directly. What happens if the report was made? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then we'll know soon, he said, one way or another. The next 60 days were the longest of Marin Solis's life, and she spent them preparing. Not with weapons. She had no weapons and no particular expertise in violence. She prepared the way she knew how to prepare, which was meticulously, systematically, with a focus on what she actually knew rather than what she feared. What she knew, The entities required an electromagnetic field of specific characteristics to maintain a foothold in standard four-dimensional space. Without that field, the physics of their existence in this dimension were unsustainable. What she knew, the entities could perceive and interact with electromagnetic systems, which meant that any defense based on electronic control would eventually fail. She knew the aperture required power. Not much power by industrial standards, enough to run a modest laboratory full equipment suite, which meant that the entity's ability to enter and remain in this dimension was constrained by access to human power infrastructure. She concluded, after 60 days, you did not fight them, you cut the lights. She wrote a 30-page technical document titled Dimensional Exclusion, a practical framework. She sent it to the Institute. The Institute sent it to the Joint Interplanetary Defense Tribunal, which had been convened 6 weeks earlier in response to 17 separate reports of anomalous dimensional activity from stations and research outposts distributed across 4 planetary bodies. None of the other reports included a detailed technical explanation of the mechanism. None of them included a successful exclusion protocol. The Joint Tribunal read the document. Then they read it again. Then they called her. You're telling us, the tribunal chair said, the solution to a potential extra-dimensional incursion is to cut the power. I'm telling you, Marin said. The incursion requires our infrastructure to operate. We built the door. We ran the power to it. All we have to do is stop. And if they find another way to power the aperture, they can't generate power in this dimension. They're observational organisms, sensory beings. They experience and they transmit. The power has to be ours. She paused. That's the thing about opening a door and then being afraid of what comes through it. The door is still yours. You built it. You can close it. The tribunal chair looked at her across the communication link. That's simple, he said. That's simple, she said. The hard part is being willing to go into the dark. The incursion, when it came, was not one event. It was 17 simultaneous events across 6 research installations. All of them at sites where dimensional refraction research had been conducted. All of them occurring within a 6-hour window on a Thursday morning in late autumn. Marin was at the Callaway station when it started because she had never left. The entities came through 6 apertures that had been left unmonitored. Remnant leakage from calibration runs. Dimensional thinning that no one had thought to patch because no one had thought to look. They were larger than the Scout. More numerous. Proof. They moved through the stations with the unhurried efficiency of things that knew exactly where they were going, because they did. The Scout had reported back, had mapped everything, had told them where the power was, and where the food was, and where the doors. But Marin had distributed her document. The tribunal had read it. The installation commanders had read it. And every installation in the network had, in the 60 days since the document had been filed, installed manual power cutoffs, orange-handled levers, 1 per grid, rated for full simultaneous circuit interrupt. Callaway Stations was in the basement. She knew where it was. She had installed it herself. The call came at 0340. She was already awake. She did not run. She walked, because running would mean panicking, and she had learned 60 days ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She walked down the stairs and through the corridor and into the basement, and she pulled the lever. The lights went out. Across the network, 17 lever pulls in 6-hour sequence, some by people who were afraid, some by people who were very afraid, some by people who were so afraid that they did it anyway, because Marin Solis had told them it would work, and they had decided to believe her. Power cut. The apertures folded. The entities, caught between dimensions without the electromagnetic bridge they needed, found themselves in a space that could not sustain them. Not hostile, not weaponized, simply withdrawn. The welcome sign taken down. The door closed politely but completely. In the dark of the Callaway station basement, Marin Solis stood with her back against the concrete wall and counted to 60. On 60, she turned her phone light on. She waited another 10 minutes. Then she went back up. The lab was empty. Just the equipment and the copper-wound coils in the 4 months of someone's life, pinned to the walls, in equations and evidence, and the particular stubbornness of a person who had spent 11 years being laughed at and had finally been right about something. The air was ordinary. Pressure was ordinary. Nothing was looking at her. She sat at her desk and began to write the post-event report. It was a long report. It covered the scouts' behavioral patterns, the modification of the calibration system, the power dependency analysis, the 60 days of preparation, the exclusion protocol and its network-wide deployment. It covered what she knew and what she suspected and what she could not yet prove. At the end, she heated a section she had been arguing with herself about for days and finally written at 0200 the night before, and which she included because she was a scientist and precision mattered. The section was titled, On What the Entity Was Trying to Convey. It was short. It said, the entity was hungry and it was looking for a way to feed, and it found one because we offered it. This was not malice, and it was not invasion in any sense we apply to that word. It was appetite. The mistake was not in conducting the research. The mistake was in forgetting that a window is transparent in both directions. We looked through, and something looked back, and it was better fed and faster and more patient than us, and it would have prevailed in any contest of direct power. It could not account for was our willingness to go without. That is the specifically human element in this. Not high strength, not technology, not ingenuity, even though there was ingenuity involved. The thing that closed the door was the decision to stand in the dark, to give up the light we had made, the warmth we had built, the extended reach of our electromagnetic civilization, all of it, and wait. An entity that experiences the world through observation cannot comprehend the choice to stop being observed. An intelligence that experiences reality as sensation cannot comprehend from a preference for nothing. We won because we were willing to turn it off. That is not comfortable to say. It does not make for good recruitment posters. It is not the story anyone wanted, the one where humanity faces the void and triumphs through fire and fury. It is the other story. The one where a woman stands in a basement with her hands on an orange lever and decides that the dark is better than the alternative. But it is the true one, and I am a scientist. Precision matters. She filed the report at 0530. Then she made coffee from the emergency supplies because the main water heater was still offline, and she sat at her desk and drank it. And outside the windows, the highlands were beginning to show against a sky, going from black to deep blue to the particular gray of early morning. And the wind was coming off the hills, smelling of copper and rain. And Marin Solis sat alone in the building she had built her work in and thought about doors. She thought about what it means to build a door, how much of the work is in the building, and how little of it, almost none of it, almost zero, accounts for what might want to come through from the other side. She thought about Jonah, who was at the institute now, in a medical observation unit, having long conversations with researchers who were trying to understand what the entity had conveyed to him in those final minutes, and whether any of it was mappable, and whether the map, if made, would be worth the reading. She thought he would be all right. She was not certain. She thought the specific brightness that had been burning in him for 11 years was still there, just pointed somewhere different now. Inward rather than outward, at the thing he'd seen rather than the proof he'd sought. She thought that was probably survivable. She thought most things were survivable, by people who were willing to sit with them in the dark. She drank her coffee. The sky went gray, and then pale, and then a thin watercolor blue. In the walls around her, the copper cables were silent. Breakers were off. The generators were idle. The building was as dark as she'd left it, electrically speaking. A machine at rest, unpowered, presenting no signal, offering no invitation. On the other side of wherever the entities were, nothing was visible. She intended to keep it that way for a while. Not forever. Science does not work forever. The document she'd filed included, in its final pages, a framework for controlled re-engagement, a protocol for opening the aperture again, someday, under conditions that were safer and more deliberate and informed by everything she now knew. The entities were not evil. They were hungry. Those were different problems, and one of them was possibly solvable. She was a scientist. She believed in the solvable, but not today. Today the building was dark, and the air was ordinary, and nothing was looking at her. And she sat at her desk with her cold coffee and her very long report, and she thought, this is what it means to be human in a universe that is older and larger and stranger than anything we have yet prepared for. Not the winning, not the technology, not the fire. The willingness to turn off the lights and wait. To choose the dark and hold it until the choice becomes an answer. She finished her coffee. She set down the mug. She opened a new document on her tablet and titled it very simply, "What We Do Next." Then she began.